Slavery in the territories. I want to point out here, this is part of chapter 14 all the way up to the section entitled Senate Bloodshed. So just kind of be aware of that. So we're going to start looking at this time period of 1846 all the way up to 1861. However, the thing is, slavery was not, of course, a new political issue by the time we get to this point. After all, we've seen things like the Missouri Compromise, the nullification controversy, the battles in Congress over all the abolitionist mailings leading to the whole gag rule. But after 1846, these clashes over slavery, and thus between the North and the South congressmen, are going to become a lot more frequent, and they're going to become a lot more difficult to resolve. So we're really going to see that sectional antagonism come to the forefront of American society. Now, the flashpoint that's really going to bring slavery to the front of politics is going to be all of the territory that is acquired from Mexico at the end of the Mexican-American War and how to treat slavery in these territories. So you have to think the West is not just a geographical location for people at this time. It really was a symbol of like the hopes and dreams of, well, white Americans. It was more about a fresh start and the land of possibilities. So if one was to exclude slavery from the West, this is basically excluding white Southerners from pursuing what their version of the American dream was. Now, Northern politicians at this time most definitely would have argued with that perspective. They felt like excluding slavery would actually preserve equality, and more specifically, the equality of all white men and women to live and work without having to compete against slave labor. So between like the 1840s all the way up till 1861, so this time period leading up to the Civil War, the North and the South are going to have to try to find some sort of solution to the issue of allowing or not allowing slavery in the territories. There are going to be four big proposals at this time. The first idea was outright exclusion, just not allowing slavery in the territories. The second proposal was just an extension of the Missouri Compromise line all the way across the United States to the Pacific Ocean. So if you can see that line there, and imagine it extending all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and so everything south would be allowed to have slaves and everything north of it would not. The third solution was the idea of popular sovereignty. Please know what this term means. So popular sovereignty is basically going to allow the residents of a territory to decide the issue for themselves. So they would vote when they're becoming a state. Do we want to be a slave state or do we want to be a free state? Think of popular sovereignty. Sovereignty is having the say over the land, and then popular sovereignty, so by popular opinion, so by the people, thus popular sovereignty. And then the fourth is the other opposite extreme from the first, which is protection of property. Now, by protection of property, this really means protection of the property of slaveholders, meaning protection of their ability to own slaves, even if very few actually lived in a territory. Now, this debate of these proposals is eventually going to lead us to the Compromise of 1850. Now, before I get into that, I want you to think of these four proposals. And in your opinion, as a part of your journal also today, which of these do you think would be the best in order to avoid war? So don't say what you think would be just like what you would vote for or anything like that. What would be the best to avoid war? So in 1846, David Wilmot, who was a Pennsylvania Democrat, is going to offer an amendment to the appropriations bill of the Mexican War. And this amendment basically said that no territory acquired from the war would allow slavery or involuntary servitude. Now, keep in mind this does exclude Texas because Texas was already a state in the Union at that point. But in this provision known as the Wilmot Proviso, not only would this outlaw slavery in all of the new territories, but it also tried to link the exclusion of slavery to the freedom of white people. And this was trying to gain support basically across the North and even trying to gain support across the Upper South. It doesn't really work though. This really infuriated the South because they felt like the Wilmot Proviso implied that the mere proximity to slavery was degrading and that supposedly then white Southerners were considered a degraded people and basically unfit to join in other Americans in the territories. The thing is, at this point in time, Northern lawmakers really made up a majority of the House of Representatives. And so the Wilmot Proviso and actually about 50 other versions of this proviso are going to pass in the House of Representatives between 1846 and 1850. But every time it got to the Senate, it would be rejected there. So it never becomes law. But that tells you already we're looking at that there's a larger population in the North, causing them to have larger representation in the House of Representatives. And this actually brings us to the election of 1848. Both the Democrats and the Whigs don't want to identify too strongly for the proviso or against the proviso because they could both recognize that this could cause problems within their party. And so they're going to really select their candidates very carefully. The Democrats are going to put forward one Lewis Cass. He was a party stalwart. He really understood the destructive potential of the slavery issue, and he was really for popular sovereignty. He had suggested actually that the territorial residents, not Congress, should get to decide slavery's fate. And the thing is, this idea of popular sovereignty really did have like a do-it-yourself charm. You know, keep the politicians out of it. Let the people decide for themselves. The other part of this is if you were pushing for popular sovereignty, this would basically be decided when a state was applying for statehood. So until that moment, that meant that slavery basically would be legal in the territory. Whigs are going to be silent on the slavery issue. They're going to nominate General Zachary Taylor, and if you're going, hey, I remember that name, he is of Mexican War fame. The thing is, General Zachary Taylor had really no political record. He really had not belonged to any political party until this point. He had never voted, but you can see his view on slavery by looking at his background. He lived in Louisiana, so he's living in the lower South, and he owned over 100 enslaved individuals on his own plantation. Also, his daughter, who unfortunately by this point actually had died, she had been married to Jefferson Davis, Mississippi's staunch pro-slavery senator. Also, Jefferson Davis is the future president of the so-called Confederacy later on. So Taylor's background is going to be a bit disturbing to a lot of the anti-slavery Northern Whigs. And so some of them are actually going to bolt party and actually form the Free Soil Party that very much appealed on the position of that they were opposed to slave labor in the territories, thus free soil. This was taking the position that free labor just couldn't compete against slave labor. They're actually going to nominate Martin Van Buren. He doesn't take a single electoral college vote, but he does take quite a few popular votes. In the end, You can see here, though, Taylor is going to dominate the South, and he is going to be the first elected president from the lower South.